Well, good evening. I'm Jacob Hornberger, president of the Future of Freedom Foundation, and welcome back to the Jacob Hornberger Hour. Great to be back with you guys. Merry Christmas. Trust y'all are having a happy holiday season. Tonight, I want to talk about public schooling, or as libertarians oftentimes refer to it as government schooling. And of course, the reason we refer to it as government schooling is because public schooling is nothing more than just another government program. In fact, I often wonder why they call it public schooling. Like when you have a store like Walmart, you don't say, well, we're going to the public store. You just say, well, we're going to the store. Or, when you're going to Safeway, you don't say, well, we're going to the public grocery store. You just say, hey, we're going to the grocery store. But for some reason, they call this government program public schooling. And of course, it is a government program. Whether you're talking about at a local level, the government school board where you have politicians running for office, and those are the people that run the system, the politicians, and they hire the bureaucrats and they hire the teachers but it's a government institution. There's no question about it. You got government officials operating this thing at a local level. Or at the state level, the State Department of Education. These are government officials. They're usually appointed by the state legislature, nominated by the governor, but it is a government structure. And then, of course, we're all familiar with the Federal Department of Education. That's the federal government's role in public schooling. So this is why libertarians call this institution government schooling sometimes, because it's a government program. Now, I think it would be difficult to find a better example of a socialist model than government public schooling. To me, it's like the epitome of a socialist program. Now, let's review first of all what we mean by the term socialism, because it has, socialism has variations to it. In the pure sense, you've got government ownership of the means of production, or let's just say government ownership of everything. The factories, the businesses, the retail establishments. This is effectively the kind of system that say exists in Cuba or North Korea. In Cuba, for example, the government owns essentially everything. Now, I've been to Cuba, visited there, stayed in Havana several days, went off to another town, spent a couple of days there. And it's fascinating because the government essentially owns everything. There was a few private sector things, like a lady out selling snow cones, I think, in a little cart. There was some little fair where they had book dealers and so forth, selling other stalls selling trinkets, but really, really tiny. You walk down the street of Havana and streets of Havana, and everything is government owned. You walk by a pharmacy, for example, and all the shelves are bare. It's dark. This is the middle of the day, and so there's a depressed type of environment there. But that's your pure socialist system. Now, you can also have socialistic programs. And the primary characteristic of socialistic programs is where the government's taking money from one group of people in order to transfer it to another group of people. They take it with taxation, and then they've got the welfare bureaucracies that are over here redistributing the money, supposedly to the poor, needy, and disadvantaged. Now, of course, we know that that's not just where the money goes. It goes in the hands of the politically privileged, the bankers, the Wall Street people. It goes in the hands of foreign dictatorships and so forth. But the whole idea of this socialistic, let's say, welfare state, as we've come to know about it, is it incorporates the Marxian principle of from each according to ability to each according to need. In other words, that government should take from those who have, the wealthy, the middle class, in order to equalize wealth, redistribute it to the poor. Now, returning to Cuba again, I mean, here you have, the liberal dream, the so-called progressive dream, in terms of redistribution of wealth, of equality. When Castro took over, you he took everything from the wealthy. You know, it wasn't just confiscating a little bit of an estate tax or making the income tax a little bit more progressive. No, 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 no. He said, let's carry the liberal statist principles to their logical conclusion. And so he just took everything from the rich, the businesses, the homes, and everything, and then redistributed it to the poor. Now, of course, what ends up happening is that the rich say, "To heck with this! I'm out of here," and a lot of them went away, and then they declined well, they can't open up businesses, and so everything just starts cratering in on itself, and everybody is equally poor. So, but that's the idea of a socialistic program. Now, what are examples of socialistic programs here in the United States? Well, you've got, Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, public schooling. I mean, this is like I say, a model of a socialistic program. Why? Well, because the way the system's funded is that the state takes money from those who have property, those who have money, and then uses it to educate the children of people who have children, the families that have children. I mean, you may even have, well, you do have people who are being taxed that don't have children, never have had children, and their money is being taken them to fund the education of people that do have children. And it's only it's in this area of education. For example, suppose you had a government program that takes money from people that don't have children in order to fund food or clothing of people who have children. Well, it would be the same principle, a socialistic program where the state is taking money from one group of people in order to redistribute it to another group of people. Now, another aspect of socialism is the concept of central planning. And this is where the government centrally plans some particular activity in the marketplace. In previous shows, I've talked about the Federal Reserve. There's your model for socialistic central planning. You've got an established board, a government-appointed board that is planning the monetary affairs of, hundreds of millions of people. And, as Friedrich Hayek, the Nobel Prize-winning libertarian economist, pointed out, is that this kind of system is going to result in lots of chaos, crises. And we see that, as I've pointed out in previous shows, in the monetary sphere. I mean, this is why you have a debased dollar. This is why you had the Great Depression. This is why you've had, the debasement, devaluation of the dollar for, more than 100 years, some 100 years now. This is what socialistic central planning does. It creates what Ludwig von Mises called planned chaos. That there's just always crises, there's chaos, and so forth. Why? Well, Hayek pointed it out, and when he used the term the fatal conceit, because what's happening is that this body of people that are planning this activity are pretend to have it in their minds that they're able to plan the complex monetary activities of hundreds of millions of people when people's valuations are changing instantaneously. And yet here are these, let's say 20 planners saying, oh, we can plan all of these things. Well, as Hayek pointed out, the minute they come up with a plan, it's already outdated because of the constantly changing valuations of people in the marketplace. So that's why you always end up with shortages when you've got central planning, or a shabby product, crises, chaos. We're seeing that in the monetary sphere today. Well, guess what? This is exactly what public schooling is modeled on, this socialistic concept of central planning. Now, if you look at it from the local level, I mean, you can see it real clearly. This is a state board that is planning the or a local board of school board is planning the educational decisions of thousands, tens of thousands of children. It's a top-down command and control system. You've got the school board. It's coming up with the policies, the plans. It sends those plans down to the superintendents. The superintendents carry it down to the teachers. And so it's this pyramid where it's sort of a planned down command and control system. Same thing at the state level. The state is planning, the textbooks that are going to be used, sets the guidelines for the curriculum. But again, it's this notion of top-down central planning. And of course, the biggest top-down is the federal government, where Washington pretends that, boy, Washington people are really smart. They're much smarter than those local people, the superintendents and the school boards, and they're going to set the standards by which people are going to get educated in these public schools, and they're finally going to make public schools work. And so, it's not surprising then that public schooling is just known for its crises, its chaos, just the mess that it produces. It's not a surprise that the President of the United States decided not to send his two daughters into the D.C. public schools. I mean, whatever may be said about Obama, he is not an ignorant man. I mean, he's a very smart man. And he cares about his daughters. He obviously cares about them, and he's not gonna worry about public opinion. Why aren't you sending your kids into public schools? I thought you believed in equality. I thought you believed in public schooling. He's not going to worry about that because his love for his children predominate, and so he decides to send his children into private schools because private schools are generally better than public schools. But let's not make any bones about it. The private school system is government licensed. It's government supervised, government monitored. I mean, they can always have their license yanked, and they're always aware of that. And so many times, the same structure, the same things they're teaching in the public schools is mirrored in the private schools. Now, let me turn to the kind of system we have here in the United States. It's kind of interesting the way it's developed. I mean, we've got the public schools, okay? I mean, there you have direct government control. Now, this is where most people send their children. It's free in the sense that you've already paid for it with taxation. It's subsidized by other people, many of whom that don't have children. And so most people default to the free system. They send their kids to this at 6 years old. They send their kids to the school bus, or they take them over there, and they turn them over to these government officials. They're there for 5-6 hours a day, 5 days a week, 9 months a year, for 12 years. I mean, this is the mandate, and this falls under the concept of compulsory education laws. There's no option here. That parents have to do this under the law. Now, okay, there's two other options though that people can exercise. They can send their kids into private school. But every private school though has got to be government approved, government licensed. And if a government school isn't doing what they're supposed to be doing in the eyes of the state, they can have that license yanked. Now, generally speaking, there's the perception that private schools have a better education than the public schools. I mean, that's why President Obama sends his children into private schools. The problem is that most people can't afford this option. I mean, private schools are very, limited in number, and to get a license to run a private school is not easy. So you've got the supply is limited by the state. And the prices for tuition are exorbitant. I mean, they're almost, at the college level. And so most people, again, default to the public school option. It's free in the sense they've already paid for it with their taxes. If they send their kids into private school, they've got to pay that tuition, and they don't get any credit for the taxes that they've paid to the public school system, even though they're not using the system. I mean, at that point, they're in essentially the same position as a person who doesn't have any children at all. He doesn't use the system, and he's having to fund it. And so most people cannot afford the private school option. They send their kids into the public school system. Now, the third option is an interesting option. This is the homeschooling option. Now, this hasn't always been the case. I remember back in the 50s and 60s, homeschooling was not permitted. The state simply would not permit it. The only two options that the state would permit under its control of the education system was private schools and public schools. In fact, there was a man named John Singer that refused to send his kids into the public school system. Now, he lived out west. I forget the town, the state. I think it was like Utah or something like that. Perhaps there wasn't any private school option. I don't know. But he insisted on just keeping his kids at home because he did not want to subject them to government control over their minds. And the state went after him. They got orders commanding him to send his kids into this government school system, to submit his children to the control of government officials, to be taught the right way. Singer refused to do it. He just kept insisting that he was going to keep his kids at home. He would educate his kids. And, they finally got a warrant for his arrest, and he was going out to his mailbox one day, and the cops around there that had it surrounded, secretly, they were hiding. They claimed that he was reaching for a gun. He didn't have any gun, but he was shot to death. And it was sort of a confirmation of what, libertarians often say, that, if you don't send your kids to school, they'll kill you. If you don't pay your taxes, they'll kill you. And the reason is because you've got to follow this logical sequence of events that, they'll put liens on your land in the cases of taxes, or garnish your bank account. In the case of schools, they'll get court orders, and they'll finally hold you in contempt, and they'll issue a warrant for your arrest, or they'll try to evict you from your house in terms of taxes. And if you resist with force, or if they think you're resisting with force, they're going to kill you. It's called resisting arrest. And that's what happened to Singer. Well, gradually, more and more people, especially in Christians, they just would not want to submit their children into this government school system. And so the movement for homeschooling grew and grew until now it's a well-recognized, acceptable system. But even here, in most states, you've got government monitoring. Now, clearly, the control of the state over the mind of the child is much less with homeschooling. But still there's that sense of monitoring. If they have the authority, if they don't like what the tests are revealing, and they give periodic tests in most states, they can yank those kids from the parents and move them back into the governmental system where they're being taught by government officials. So you've got less control at the homeschooling level. You've got a little bit more control at the private system in terms of state control. In the public school system, which is where most people default, the power of the state is direct. It operates directly on the child. Now, where do libertarians stand on this? Well, this is one of the separation points between libertarians and liberals and conservatives. Liberals and conservatives believe in government schooling. Okay, they consider government schooling to be a backbone of the free enterprise system in America, and liberals love it. I mean, because it's sort of like an equal system. Everybody's treated the same. Everybody's put into the first grade, and you hang around with people your own age, and you do this all through public school. It's kind of interesting. It's the only time in your life where you hang out with only people your own age. That was pointed out by Sheldon Richman in this book that we published called Separating School and State, which is really the defining book, in my opinion, in the libertarian movement as far as just separating school and state. That's the only solution. That's the libertarian solution. Now, conservatives are kind of interesting on this issue because, conservatives, love their mantras, free enterprise, private property, and limited government. I mean, that's their favorite mantra. And you can see it on their websites. And you can't go to a conservative conference without at least, half the speakers using that mantra, that we believe in free enterprise, private property, and limited government. And yet, when you say, well, how about a free market in education, conservatives? Man, they go ballistic. Oh my gosh! Oh no! Education's too important to be left to the hands of the free market. The conservatives say you've got to have government doing this. You can't have private property here. You can't have limited government here. This is a function of government. Now, the interesting twist to this, I brought up Cuba at the beginning of my talk tonight, and when I was traveling in Cuba, I made it a point to go into downtown Havana and search out the Department of Education. Well, you see, guess what one of the real pride and joys of Fidel Castro is? Now, we all will agree that Fidel Castro is a socialist, right? I mean, he's a communist, too. Well, he's got two things that he's most proud of as far as the Cuban Revolution is. One is free public schooling for everyone in Cuban society, and the other is free national health care. Sound familiar? And so I was intrigued by this because I knew that public schooling is a backbone of Cuba's socialist system. I mean, this is what socialism's all about: government central planning, equality, and so forth. And so it's kind of, it's always amusing to me when I hear conservatives in the same speech extolling their mantra of free enterprise, private property, and limited government, and at the very same time later in the speech talking about how important public schooling is to our system of government here, our free market system as they call it. Well, let me digress here and tell you kind of a funny story. That many, many years ago I was in Brazil to give a talk, and a guy had heard me give a speech in Chile. He was from Brazil, and so he contacts me. He says, "Jacob, we're putting on a conference on education down here in Porto Alegre, Brazil, and I would like you to come and give a presentation on education." And, I just naturally assumed that he knew where we stood. That's, the free market and education. And so I said, "Hey, I'd love to, Roy." We'd kind of gotten to be friends. And so I fly down for this conference. And they call the panel. There's like 1,000 people at this conference. And it was sponsored by a free enterprise group in Porto Alegre, Brazil. And the media's there because all these high-flying public officials are participating in this conference. And I forget the position of the guy that was with me on this panel, but he was like, the president of the country or the current minister of Department of Education. I can't remember what his title, but he was a super bigwig in the government. Well, there's three of us up there on the stage, and it's the government official and Roy, my friend, and me. Well, Roy, presents both of us, introduces us, and this guy goes first. And he starts telling everyone in the audience that the secret to improving the public school system in Brazil is to copy the system that the United States has. The public school system in the United States. That they just, to get the standards up, they got to be doing this and this and this. And he cites all these things that they're doing in the public schools in the United States. Well, so, I finally turned to Roy and I whispered to him, I said, "Do you have any idea what I'm going to say in this speech?" He turns back to me and he says, "Why do you think I invited you?" So, of course, I proceed to give the libertarian case, and this guy's eyes were wide open because what I was saying was, is the libertarian case is a free market in education, that's the only solution to the crises and chaos that are involved in public schooling. A total separation of school and state. Remember what our ancestors did with church and state. Okay? We don't have government centrally planning the religious activity of the people. We don't have mandatory church attendance laws. We've developed a tolerance for how people raise their children. We might disagree with how a family raises their children. Some of them don't send their kids to church. Some of them, teach their children to be agnostic, atheists, devil worshippers. Who cares? I mean, it's not something that we want government to get involved with. We may vehemently disagree with what they're doing, but we've developed this tolerance, and it's because many, many, many centuries ago, somebody came up with this idea of freedom of religion, where we don't have the state mandating that people go to church, that they send their children to receive religious education. We let the families decide these things. This is exactly what libertarians hold with respect to education. That education is a seeking process. Each child is different. He's unique. He's one of a kind. That God has created every individual differently. And so you have different needs and different abilities and different talents and different interests. And so what we say is let the family make these decisions based on what each different child's interests and needs and wants are. That this is the responsibility of the family to nurture the interests of each individual child as they begin developing, rather than in the cookie cutter, everybody's treated the same old that goes on in public schools. Now, people sometimes say, oh, well, Jacob, what would happen to the poor, Well, this is that, again, as I've talked about in previous shows, this is that lack of faith and freedom. That what the welfare state has done to Americans. It's inculcated this sense of, oh my gosh, freedom won't work. The poor will go uneducated. Well, do the poor have any trouble finding churches to go into? I mean, suppose we'd had a system for 100 years of public churching in addition to public schooling, and I were to come along and say, hey, let's get rid of the public churching system. The statists would say to me, well, what about the poor? Where will they go to church? And I would say, well, the probability is that people would donate to churches and they wouldn't worry about who's coming in, whether the poor are donating or not. People do it because they think it's right. Well, and that's exactly the kind of system we have. I don't know of any church anywhere in the United States that denies people the right to come into church simply because they're poor. I don't think there's any admission at all in terms of walking into church. Well, that's the idea of education, that people would support education. But you'd have a whole multiplicity of options. You'd have for-profit schools. You'd have amelioratory schools, where they're just doing it out of donations and because they want to help people. You'd have scholarship funds. I mean, right now you see the billionaires. They're donating, half their fortune. Some of them are donating to public schools. I mean, it's a real horror story. I mean, it's just amazing that these people have so much money and have this blind spot in favor of statism. What they really ought to be doing is funding enterprises that call for a separation of school and state. Get the state out of this business. And so that's one of the things that really separates us out as libertarians. And, we believe in freedom. We believe in the market process. And this is demonstrated by our commitment to separate school and state and have a total free market in education. Now, this includes the repeal of mandatory attendance laws, gone. The end of all public school buildings, sell them off, donate them to the poor, whatever you want to do. No more government textbooks, no more school boards, no more, state boards of education, no more Department of Education. Just ditch them all and have a totally free market in education, the same way we have a free market in whatever else we have, a free market in religion and goods and services and so forth. That this is the real solution to the chaos and crises that afflict public schools. Now, let me say something about vouchers, because this is a favorite conservative reform measure. I mean, that's what's really another funny thing about conservatives is that, they preach these free market mantras, but they spend so much of their time, if not all their time, coming up with ways to reform the welfare state. And public schooling is just another welfare state program. I mean, it's taking money from people who have money in order to fund the education of people who don't have money. Now, we all know the conservatives are famous for condemning, the food stamp mother in the grocery store line or the recipient of public housing and so forth. But so what do they do? They come up with this voucher program that's really just nothing more than a food stamp system applied to education. I mean, it's just a straight welfare program for the middle class or for the poor, whatever. I mean, these are conservatives, the advocates of free markets, private property, and limited government. They're calling for a welfare scheme, and they've done it for decades now, where the government takes money from one group of people in order to fund the education of another group of people through these so-called vouchers. Now, some libertarians back these things too. The libertarians say, "Oh, well, this is a transition from the government system to a total free market system." Well, that's just nonsense. It's no more a transition system than any other reform system in the public schools. It actually entrenches the state into the into the educational system. Why? Well, now you've got an entirely new segment of people that are dependent on the state's largesse. The private schools that are now receiving these vouchers. I mean, they have their budgets based on these things. They go out and hire new teachers. They expand their buildings. They expand their operations. What are the chances that the recipients of these vouchers are going to all of a sudden come and say, well, we'd like to now transition to the end of all government involvement in education? It's not going to happen. It's going to entrench the system. We've seen wherever they have vouchers. It's a welfare program. It's a bureaucracy program. And the arguments that are made for vouchers are usually nothing like the arguments that have to be made for the separation of school and state. The voucher proponents inevitably start talking about, this is a way that we can improve the public schools. I mean, that's one conservative I saw that he published a paper saying, hey, here's a way we can improve the public schools, provide competition. And so, you don't hear, in fact, you never hear the proponents of vouchers saying, well, we're defending these because these are a way to put government schools out of business. No, in a sense, they just become another reform. Okay, they might improve the life of somebody that's now in the private school, but that's not freedom. That's not free enterprise. I mean, that's one of my beefs with conservatives is they tell people that vouchers are the free market approach to education. That's just nonsense. That's just another statist approach to reforming the government school system. The free market approach is what we libertarians say. Separate school and state entirely. Ditch the state entirely out of education the way we've done with religion. And the free market produces the best of everything. It's so difficult for me to understand why Americans are so, adverse to trusting the free market when they see it produces the best of everything. And, of course, socialism, central planning, socialistic program produces the worst of everything. I mean, it's not a coincidence that Social Security is busted, Medicare is busted, the Federal Reserve is now inflating the money supply again. You got all that chaos with, the Wall Street and the banks and so forth. This is all Federal Reserve induced. And so you see this chaos everywhere you see these socialist programs, and you see it in education. It sort of all fits together. This is what socialistic programs produce. As Mises said, planned chaos, crises, debacles. Now, okay, what's the real downside to public schooling? And I want to talk to you about this because this is really important. Is what they do to children's minds in these institutions. And this is what most parents do not want to confront. Because, most parents, let's face it, are victims of the system. They've gone through the system. And by the time they graduate from the system, their mind has been molded to accept the system. I mean, and this is part of the problem. I mean, a minute ago I said, why are Americans so adverse to accepting the idea of a free market in education? Well, in large part because of the mindset that was inculcated in them with respect to public schooling. So that, we're all born into this system, right? I mean, we've all been raised in this system. And so it's just natural, your child reaches 6 years of age, and, the time's arrived. I guess I got to send my kids into the system. Let me walk him to the bus. Think about it. Here you have this coercive, mandatory system that's working on the mind of a child in its most formative years.
it's how natural is that? How normal is that? I mean, you think that education is a seeking process. It's a process whereby you're loving to learn. You're interested in something. You're just absorbing it. You can't get enough of it. You're looking for books, or you're going to classes, and you find something you love that you're passionate about, and you're just absorbing it. And, you don't think in terms of, oh, gosh, this is so grueling. I hate it. No, because you love it, because you want to learn about it. That's what genuine education is all about. That's not what happens in public schooling. In public schooling, it's an information cramming system where they're cramming information into your head, and you're expected to memorize it. And then they have tests to determine whether you're learning their information. All right, and so it's exactly opposite. In other words, you've got coercion and education coming together. Now, imagine that. Coercion and education. Doesn't seem to make much sense, does it? Now, notice that when you see a kid at 0 to 6, there's a sense that you can see it in every kid's face. I mean, you see a kid, looking around at everything, like a newborn baby, 6 months old, up to 8 months, 9 months. His eyes are wide-eyed. He's just looking around. He's absorbing everything around him. There's a sense of awe, like an awe of the universe. It's like, wow, look at this. I mean, there's a genuine curiosity, wanting to learn more. Every kid from the time he can speak, he bedevils his parents with that, terrifying word, 3-letter word, why? Because, a parent sits there and says enough, at some point. Because every time you answer a kid's question on why, the next question is going to be why. And because there's this sense of learning, this natural sense of, wow, I've been born into this life. Why am I here? What is this all about? And so this is, becomes the lifelong quest of trying to discover what is life all about. What was I born for? What is the purpose of life? All that comes to a screeching halt at 6 years of age. Everything stops at that point because the child is forced into a system that is really nothing more than a variation of Army boot camp. I mean, think about boot camp, where, there's a sense of conformity and teaching obedience and drop down for 10 push-ups and there's the formations, right face and left face and marching in parades and marching in unison and yes sir and no ma'am and everything is conformity. That's what public schooling is all about. It's a variation. It's a light. It's boot camp light. Okay, the kids are in there, and what their primary purpose there is to learn conformity, to learn deference to authority. That when the government officials say something, they're the authorities. They know what's best. We've got to trust them. This sense of obedience that okay, you can complain about your classes, but you can't challenge the system itself. And because you're not going to have, for example, any libertarian courses taught in public schools, I guarantee you that. Now, there are libertarian teachers, which is kind of interesting. They're kind of like moles in the system. They're teachers that love to teach. But, the only system, and the way the government monopolizes so much of it, is that if they want to teach, you got to teach in this system, and they do, introduce libertarian notions. But the idea of walking into a public school, which I've done before, I spoke at a school here in Virginia, an advanced school. They had a libertarian club, and I came and gave a lecture on libertarianism after school hours, where I talked about abolishing public schools, getting rid of these things, and getting rid of the drug war and the New Deal and so forth. And this public school teacher was sitting in the audience. When I opened it up for discussion, man, it was a teacher's dream. You had students, debating, arguing, challenging me, and even they were libertarians, but they were discussing libertarian issues. It was really exciting. Like I say, it was a teacher's dream, when people are arguing and debating and stuff after a lecture. This public school teacher stands up and starts screaming at me that this is the most ludicrous thing you've ever heard, that Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal saved free enterprise and it wasn't a socialist fascist program. I mean, the same nonsense you get in the public schools. And, of course, we need government schools. Where would the poor go to school? All this nonsense. And so he grabs his books and says, I'm leaving, and I'm inviting all the students to follow me. And the guy goes to the door, and none of the students follow him. That's pretty funny. And he looks around and realizes that and sheepishly goes back and sits down. But he had thrown water on the entire discussion. At that point, that authoritarianism had just squashed all of the discussion that was going on. And this is what goes on in public schools. It creates this mindset of obedience and deference to authority, and it eliminates that natural seeking, that love of learning, that awe of the universe, to the point that by the time the kid gets to be 18 years of age, we all know how he turns out. He hates school. He can't wait till he gets out of school. I mean, that's the whole thing. Oh, I can't wait till I graduate and get out of this system. And they hate to read. Now, there's exceptions, granted, okay. But by and large, this is what they do. They destroy this love of learning, this awe of the universe, this seeking that characterizes every kid from 0 to 6. Now, what's interesting is that there are kids that resist this kind of system. They sense that there's something wrong with this at a young age, this conformity, this boot camp type environment, this obedience to authority, the structure, the bell ringing, you got to go to class now. Wait a minute, no, I want to keep talking. No, you got to go to class now. So what some of these kids do, they naturally just start resisting the system. They're bored by it. I mean, you got a, government-approved school teacher droning on about, whatever, the Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal saved free enterprise or some nonsense like that. So they start walking around. They skip school. They're disgusted with it. Their grades are falling. And so what do the government officials say? Well, yeah, we all know what they say. That they call the parents in. They say something's wrong with your child. He's got attention deficit disorder. He's distracted. And the parent who defers to authority, because that's what they were taught, that's where their mindset was inculcated, they defer to the authority, and that's where the Ritalin goes or the Adderall. And the idea is to soften that kid's mind, soften the brain up, so that he becomes one of the group, one of them, and conforms and says, okay, I'm now one of you, and becomes the good little citizen. And that's the primary purpose of government schooling. Okay, it doesn't have anything to do with, setting educational standards. I mean, most kids can read by the time they're 6 anyway. It's the idea of producing the good little citizen, this mass of people in society that will defer to authority, defer to the state in matters of extreme importance, that when the state decides that it's going to invade a country, if they say there's WMDs, then by golly, you defer to that authority, that you got to trust the state because they have information that you don't. You got to support the troops in this endeavor. Never, ever engage in any critical thinking that challenges whether people in government are telling the truth. They create an entire mass of people of this deference to authority, inculcate this mindset of conformity, obedience. I saw a statement by Hugo Chavez recently where he was talking about the educational system in Venezuela, and he made no bones about it. He says, the idea is we've got to produce the good citizen here. And that idea is that if you can get a hold of a kid when he's 6, and you got control over his mind till he's 18, 12 years, 5 or 6 hours a day, you can mold that mind. You can get rid of that critical thinking, that sense of, I'm not going to, I'll go along with the flow. I'm not going to make any different challenges. I mean, the same type of mindset effectively that you see in the military, where people follow orders. They go with the flow. You make waves, you pay a price. That's the idea here. It's to produce the good citizen that is not going to challenge government at a fundamental level. It's going to defer to authority. Hey, we got to keep things secret. National security. Oh, okay. If they're saying it's national security, then oh yeah. Hey, they're the government. Wow, yeah. Okay, that's what they're doing, and in fact, that's what they do in Cuba. I mean, you remember I said that in Cuba they have public schooling. Why? North Korea too, to produce the good citizen. Now, the other thing as part of this, of producing a good citizen, is you want to convince the citizen that all this is freedom under which he's living, that the public school system is freedom and free enterprise, that Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, it's all freedom and free enterprise. The warfare state, the empire, it's all essential to America's free enterprise system. It's all just one big free enterprise system. That's the big benefit of public government schools, because that's what they inculcate in people's minds. Now, you all know that if you've listened to my previous programs, you know what I'm talking about when I say that, people, the big challenge we face in America is that people honestly believe this is all freedom and free enterprise that we have, the welfare state and the warfare state. Why do they believe that? That's the power of public schooling. Now, when I was in Cuba, remember, they have public schooling there. And what was interesting is that part of the people there believed they were free too. And, for example, when I went to get my my visa from the Cuban interest section in Washington, I told them that, I could have gotten a tourist visa very easily, but I didn't want that. I wanted a journalist visa so that I could interview people and not worry about being arrested. And I wanted to be taking notes and stuff. And so I went to the Cuban interest section, and I met with the official there, and I said, I want to go in as a journalist here. I'm a libertarian. I want to interview people. And he says, fine, we'll give you the journalist visa. And I said, now, am I free to go out on the streets? And he looked at me and laughed and said, you're going to find that people in Cuba are free, much freer than they are here in the United States. But what was interesting about this is there was no doubt in my mind from watching that man's face that he truly believes this. He truly believes that people in Cuba are free. If you go to North Korea today, and you go out and interview people, and let's say they're not scared about what's going to happen to them, it's all confidential, I have no doubts that the average North Korean citizen would say, yes, of course I'm free, because of the public schooling system. Now, what was interesting about Cuba is that when I interviewed people on the street, a lot of them knew they weren't free. They knew this was a socialist system. They didn't like it. They knew life had passed them by around the world. Now, that didn't mean that they wanted U.S. intervention. That was very clear. They respected Fidel Castro. They revered him for standing up against the United States. They didn't like what he had done with the socialist system. But they knew it was socialism. That's what was fascinating. Here in the United States, you've got these same programs, the public schooling, the Social Security, the Medicare, the Medicaid, the whole welfare state system. The average American thinks he's free. This is free enterprise. This is the problem that faces both liberals and conservatives. That you go to any conference of liberals and conservatives, and they'll talk about America's free enterprise system and stuff, and they'll be extolling these welfare state programs, including public schooling. And why is that? Because of the mindset that was inculcated in them from the first grade. You live in a country that's based on free enterprise. It's based on freedom, where the free enterprise system failed in 1929, but Franklin Roosevelt's, they don't call it socialist and fascist programs. They say his reforms saved free enterprise. And this is the problem we're facing. Now, the Tea Party people are kind of interesting because you get the sense they're trying to break through, but they just are not there. I've been to Tea Party meetings, and it's so interesting because they'll exclaim against out-of-control spending, and they'll revere the Constitution and the Declaration, but then they'll say stuff, that favors the empire, the foreign interventionism. They'll praise public schooling. They'll praise, they'll figure out ways to save Social Security. I went to a meeting the other day where some guy had come up with a plan to save Social Security. So they haven't broken free. And that's what distinguishes us libertarians. This is what it scares the statists, but it befuddles a lot of statists. They just can't figure it out because, you see, here they think they're free. Remember in previous sessions I've talked about the statist box, where you've got this box where everybody's in it, and on the walls of the inside walls are written freedom and free enterprise. So everybody thinks, hey, we're free, freedom and free enterprise. But it's a statist box. It's riddled with statism. Well, we libertarians, what distinguishes us is we've broken free. I mean, we see the system now for what it is. And we want genuine freedom. We want separating school and state. We want to ditch the welfare state programs. We want a free market in health care. We want people to keep their own money and decide what to do with it, including their own retirement and the opportunity to honor their mother and father by helping them out or to donate to the poor or whatever. I mean, this is the right of a free person. But, the statists, they look at us and say, gosh, why are they calling for freedom? I thought we lived in a free society. And then the real statists, the ideological statists, they really dislike us libertarians because we're waking people up. I mean, people are starting to realize. I mean, that was my odyssey in this thing. I mean, I was a statist. I grew up in public school, and I went through the public schooling system. I believed we were free. I thought we had free enterprise. I was a Democrat. I was a liberal. I thought, I couldn't understand why anybody would object to the government helping the poor. I thought the government had its own money. Why shouldn't it help the poor with it? And I remember when I was in law school, one afternoon, I was watching a movie on TV, and it was Ayn Rand's The Fountainhead, and I absolutely loved this movie, and I went and got the book, and I read it, but then, started studying again in law school, and kind of dropped it, and didn't search out any of her other books, and then when I got back to my hometown of Laredo, a friend of mine gave me William Simon's book, A Time for Truth, and Simon was in there talking about how we need to fight to restore, economic liberty to our land, and why, freedom was so important. And I said to my friend after I finished this book, I said, what's all this claptrap about freedom? I mean, we live in a free society. What's he talking about? And, it just hadn't hit me. And then one day I got back, I was rummaging through the public library, of all things, you imagine a government library, and I come across this little series of books that had been published many years before by the Foundation for Economic Education in New York, and I started looking at these things, and I said, oh my gosh, the scales started falling from my eyes. I started realizing this isn't a free system. It's not a free enterprise system, and I realized I'd been lied to. My mind had been molded throughout the public school process, through the state-supported university process, but all of a sudden I was breaking free of this. It was the most, probably, one of the most exciting parts of my life. And because now I could understand why there's chaos, why there's crises in society. Things started to make sense to me all of a sudden. That breakout is what distinguishes libertarians from Tea Party people who might still break out. I mean, I haven't scotched them off yet. Liberals and conservatives, it's like not much hope there. But you never know, because I was an ardent, liberal too. So there's always hope. But some of these people just appear to be incorrigible. But that's where the power of ideas comes in. I mean, that's what we do at the Future of Freedom Foundation. We spread these ideas in the hope that people will see these ideas and say, my gosh, they're right. The libertarians are right. The only solution to this is not to reform this public school system. Get rid of it. It's done enough damage to children's minds. Have a free market system where kids are treated for the unique people they are, the one-of-a-kind people that God made them, and then nurture their talents and their abilities in different ways. I mean, we don't know what the free market would produce. All we know is that, boy, entrepreneurs would be flooding the market, coming up with educational vehicles that we can't even imagine. I mean, somebody says, well, Jacob, what would it look like? I don't know. I just know that it would be terribly exciting. And it's difficult for us to even imagine. I mean, like one time I imagined, well, what about workplace schools where employers, say, bring your kids here. We're going to have the finest teachers in this company teaching, or we're going to bring them from outside. You can bring your kids to work with you. And then, gosh, people could have, dinner with or lunch with their kids and so forth. But here I am thinking, well, what would be a good system? That's not the way a free market system works. The spontaneous order produces a result that none of us could have ever even hoped to imagine. I mean, that's what Hayek talks about, the spontaneous order, that it is the results of human action, but not of human design. So that's, to me, that's in the eyes of libertarians, that's the only solution. It's the free market produces the best of everything. That's what we do at the Future of Freedom Foundation. That's what we're doing right now. And on that note, we're again, let me remind you that we're engaged in our end-of-year fundraising drive. The donations that you send us right now help us get through the coming year. We need your support. We can't do it without your support. It's a nice partnership. We've been in existence 21 years. People have kept us going with donations and bequests. Bequests have been very important to us to keep our operations going. You all know that we present this pure, uncompromising case. We upset people sometimes. This month alone, I've gotten several emails from people saying, can't donate to you because you support this or support that, whatever the uncompromising aspect of libertarianism happens to be. And I write back and I said, well, that's what we do. We present the uncompromising moral, philosophical, and economic case for the free society. And that's what we're going to continue to do. Sorry that we're not going to get your donations, but we're going to continue doing what we're going to do. And that's presenting this uncompromising moral, philosophical, and economic case for freedom. But we can't do it without those of you that help us out. And if you've never donated to the Future of Freedom Foundation, I know I got a lot of friends on Facebook now. Love to have your support. If you never donated, a good way to start is just subscribe to Freedom Daily, our journal. You can get the print journal for $25. It comes every month. It's a nice little journal. Talk to some of our longtime subscribers. Or you can donate $15 and you get the email version every month. You get it on the first of every month. You get it right there in your email box. And then, what's happened over the years is that people like what we're doing, and so the donations increase. And so, we need those big donations too, but the little ones help out. So I hope you'll consider, giving us a hand here. As Ludwig von Mises once said, when society is hurtling toward destruction, everybody's got a stake in the outcome. We can't just stand aside and say, oh, well, let's watch and see how things are going. I mean, things are not going well in this country. Gold is soaring. That's a sign. Everything's busted in the government. Iraq and Afghanistan are mired down. You got constant threats of terrorism. You've got, the infringements on civil liberties. I mean, things are coalescing toward more government control, and instead of toward a free market system with peace and prosperity and normality, where people are flying in airplanes normally again. And that's the kind of society we've got to do. But that takes critical thinking. Okay, the analytical thinking, the challenging thinking, the kind of thinking that says, even though we were born and raised in a welfare state, even though we were born and raised under a warfare national security empire state, that doesn't necessarily mean that we can't restore a free market, private property, limited government republic to our land, which is exactly what we're fighting to do at the Future of Freedom Foundation. Now, I want to let you know that I'm going to take a little break here. I'm going to skip next weekend and the following weekend, which are Christmas and New Year's. And I'll be back with you on the first weekend after the New Year. And I want to thank you very much. I'm having a good time doing this show. Appreciate y'all's support, tuning in, and of course watching the recorded version. That's one of our supporters is putting it on YouTube. We're putting it on our website now. We're podcasting it, and so having a good time. And I want to thank y'all very much for your support. And I want to wish you and your family a very Merry Christmas. In fact, from everybody at the Future of Freedom Foundation, we'd all like to wish you all a very happy holiday season and a very happy New Year, and I look forward to seeing you the first week after the New Year's. Thanks so much, and Merry Christmas.